Friends out here, let me at the outset apologize to you, hanging my head in shame that I cannot talk to you in Nepali. In spite of the fact that I have lived here for 10 years, it's a shame on me that I have not been able to pick up the language. However, there are two other 8 scheduled languages which I am familiar with, I can speak. If I speak in Tamil, which is my mother tongue, it won't be possible for me to convey what I want to convey to you. The purpose of communication, the purpose of talking, is to convey something that is close to my heart to all of you sitting here. And let me start by saying that when I was asked to come here by Sharab on behalf of the press club, I did not know that it's going to be a very, very special day for me. It's only now, after I saw the program schedule, that I realized, and it's indeed a very, very great day for me, a special day for me, for the simple reason that it also happens that Sujal Pradhan, among those who are going to receive awards here, who's going to be the recipient of Lagansheel Yuva Patrakar Puraskar 2022, is somebody whom I had the privilege, I had an opportunity to teach him for a brief while when he was a student in Sikkim University. So for this very reason, I consider this a very, very special day in my life, for instance, for the simple fact that I had the opportunity to teach him, to teach somebody like him. Let me now start with a few anecdotes. And one of it is an anecdotal experience that I had 3 decades ago, more than 30 years ago, when I started as a journalist. There was a veteran, a very senior colleague of mine, called R. Vijay Raghavan, and it was a few months that I was into journalism. And in a very casual manner, when he was there in our office, I just greeted him, "Good evening, sir." And Vijay, in fact, after that, he used to insist that we all call him Vijay, not Vijay Raghavan, not sir. And Vijay actually gave me a lesson about what journalism is all about, what this calling of being a journalist is all about. He said, "Please do not use the word sir, because we journalists, in our own profession, when we write, and there is the writing style of every newspaper, and these were still days of newspapers, television had not come into place. The writing style of every newspaper requires you to call the President of India, to call the Prime Minister of India by just calling them Mr. We don't call them anything, Sir, the Great, and so on and so forth." And that was perhaps one of the primary lessons that I learned as a journalist, that we are watchdogs in a democracy, and a democracy, or the cardinal principle of democracy, is that it is equality, one man, one vote, and all of us are equal, and democracy is the antithesis of monarchy. Democracy is the antithesis of monarchy, the opposite of monarchy. The second anecdote that I think I should talk about today is that there was a judge, Justice Albie Sachs, who belonged to the South African Liberation Movement. And it so happened that I had the opportunity, the privilege to host him for a couple of days when he was in Madras, where I lived at that point of time. And when Albie was actually talking about, and he was not just an ordinary judge. Albie Sachs was the head judge of the Truth Reconciliation Commission that was appointed in South Africa after South Africa was liberated. One of the top judges of the newly liberated nation, himself a participant in the liberation struggle. Albie had just one hand, the other hand was blown off in the course of the liberation struggle. when somebody who was an apartheid supporter threw a bomb to blow his hand off. Albie was an Irish, a white man, and yet he struggled for the liberation, for equality in South Africa, that is, demanding equality for the people who belong to South Africa, that is, the blacks. And Albie actually said that one of the first decisions that they took after liberation, that they decided to remove the honorific of honorable before the judges. And Albie then said, it is not that because the honorific was removed that the judges became less honorable. So these were two lessons, or rather sort of an anecdotal experience that I want to start off when today we are observing the 20th anniversary of the Press Club of Sikkim. It is important for us to keep in mind what and in what way is the press important, the media very important in a democracy, and more importantly for us today to even interrogate, to even spend some time asking ourselves as to how much have we progressed as a democracy in the 75 years. It's very common today that all of us are now familiar with Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. 75 years of freedom in the life of a nation that fought against foreign domination for at least 200 years. For 190 years after the Battle of Plassey, that we were subjugated by the British. And a freedom that was actually wrenched by way of an agitation, a struggle. And it is that struggle that actually led to India as a nation, as a democracy. And when we talk about that, then today when we are actually talking about 75 years of independence, it is also important for us to recall as to what actually brought about this independence. It's not about celebrating some birthday. It's not about, I'm not belittling the fact that, we cut a cake. But it's also important today when we cut the cake and observe the 20 years of the Press Club of Sikkim, we also remembered those journalists, those of who stood up for what the press and what the media that has come today. We also remembered them. And that is exactly the reason why we need to think of what went into the 75 years and where we have progressed. And in that context, I cannot but remember a few of the personalities who even in the early 19th century, to be very specific in the 1830s, there was this great intellectual, inspired by the French Revolution, inspired by Voltaire, Rousseau and Robespierre, who went out to study there. He belonged to a very rich family, had all the means to go abroad, to go to Europe and study. And when he came back, he did not hark on the glory that he studied there. On the contrary, the factors, the forces that inspired him, Voltaire, Rousseau, Robespierre, the French Revolution, all those things that he got to learn when he went abroad to study. I'm talking about Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Ram Mohan Roy in the 1830s talked about the need for a free press. 1830s. This is at least 130 years, or at least about 100 years before the great home of democracy, the United States of America, talked about a free press and talked about what the press means to a democracy. What the press means to a democracy. Before the US High Court, the Supreme Court, talked about the need for a press that is not constrained by any kind of a power or any institution that actually is above them, that the press is independent. And Ram Mohan Roy talked about a free press inspired by the French Revolution, even before the US, the American Constitution, brought about the First Amendment, and that talked about that the Congress shall not enact any legislation that curtails the freedom of the press. The press freedom is ultimate, it is not negotiable. In the 1890s, Lokmanya Bal Gangadhar Tilak in 1898 expressed himself and also stood up for a free press to the point that he stood against the colonial rule, and even when the colonial rule wanted to send him to jail invoking section 124A, that is otherwise today known the sedition law, Lokmanya Bal Gangadhar Tilak stood up and said, "If I am guilty, punish me." He stood up and said this twice. The first time he was sent to jail for 18 months, and the second time, as the law required, he was sent to Burma. He was deported to Mandalay for a period of 6 years. When Tilak came back, he was a broken man. Nevertheless, Tilak did not say that I am sorry. He stood up against section 124A. And there is also the story of another great man standing up in the court. Not a journalist by profession. In fact, he described himself as a farmer and a weaver when he was actually taken to the circuit court in Ahmedabad in 1923. He called himself, "I am a farmer and a weaver." Nevertheless, he was tried under the same charge of sedition, 124A. I'm talking about Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi stood in the court and told the judge, "The law that you are actually practicing holds me guilty of sedition. Yes, sedition is my creed. It is my creed. It is my conviction to preach disaffection against a government that is not lawful, against evil." And he told the judge, Judge Broomfield, "You have two options, Mr. Judge. One is to inflict the severest of punishment against me. I plead no mercy. Inflict the severest of punishment against me. The other option that you have is to step down from where you are. Come join me in the fight for civil liberties and a free press." The Judge Broomfield, for a change, and perhaps the only instance in the history of judiciary, he stood up, bowed before the accused. Gandhi was the accused, standing in the dock. Judge Broomfield actually stood up, bowed before him to say, "I wish there is another occasion, a higher court that actually declares my judgment wrong. Nevertheless, the law says that I need to punish you and I am sending you to jail." And it is this Gandhi who actually said, when he was talking about independence, that is Swaraj, he never used the word independence as much. He used the word Swaraj. It is Gandhi who said that civil liberties and a free press is like water that flows inside the body. And he adds, I use the word water, not blood, because water alone is something that cannot be diluted. In other words, Gandhi's statement was that there is nothing, civil liberties and a free press cannot be diluted. Now, this indeed is what the press, the media stands for. In fact, independent India's history has had a checkered kind of it goes back and forth. Nevertheless, what becomes very significant is we as a democracy have become a much better society, thanks only to those sections of the press that have stood up, that have shown the mirror to those in power. And for those in power also, it's very important because it is always possible. In fact, there is a brilliant novel by Amitava Ghosh called The Glass Palace. In fact, if you live inside a room with mirrors all over, you get to see only yourself. And you begin to delude that the world is about you and only yourself. It is in this particular context that the press becomes a very, very important institution in democracy to show the mirror to all those and to stand up to all those. And it is in this context today that we need to recall. And we also need to remember that there is something that is happening the world over. It is not many months before, not several weeks before, that a journalist called Shireen, who is a Palestinian, she did not compromise, she stood up and she got shot. Notwithstanding the fact that she knew that she was going to be killed, she spoke for her people. And this is where, before I conclude, the last part of it. So when we talk about power, we also need to be thinking of accountability. Today is a time when we have the social media where everybody thinks that, they can put out and write down anything that they want to do. And notwithstanding the consequences of what you put out. So freedom comes necessarily with responsibility, with accountability. And it is in this particular context that I would want to sort of, just sum up. Whether it is in the social media, whether it is the print, whether it is the television, that journalism is something called a calling. It's not just about another job. It's a calling, like a teacher is. And in that particular context, I have nothing else to sort of remember but the talisman, that the father of the nation, the much maligned in social media, in some sections of the social media, in what I call the WhatsApp university, Mahatma Gandhi told his followers when they all went to him asking Bapu, tell us what we should do, because now we are a free nation and the reins of power are in our hands. You give us, what do we do? And Bapu thought for a while, Gandhi thought for a while and said, recall the face of the poorest person that you have come across in your life. Recall the face of the poorest person that you have come across in your life. And ask yourself, if what you do, if what you're going to do today is going to be restoring, going to help restore the smile on that face, on her or his face, then go ahead and do it, because that's the right thing to do. Now, I'm sure that we have journalists among this gathering, and it's my humble request. Wake up in the morning and tell yourself, pray to yourself that I am not going to compromise today. I am going to be steadfast in my core conviction today. That's not over. And before you go to sleep in the evening, ask yourself, did I compromise today? Did I actually dilute the kind of conviction that I had committed myself today? And this kind of an interrogation, interrogate yourself and do it in the morning and do it in the evening and do it whenever you are there. And this is probably what will strengthen and deepen democracy. With this, I just end the short note. Thank you very much.